Have you felt it? The prices of everything seem to be going up: groceries, gas, even your favorite latte. But have you ever wondered why that is happening? And more importantly, what can we do about it? Did you know that in 2023, inflation in the US peaked at 9.1%? That is the highest in over 40 years. So if your paycheck is still the same, but prices are rising, who is winning? Definitely not your wallet. How much has inflation really impacted us? Well, in just the past year, the average American family has seen a rise of over $5,000 in annual expenses. That is a pretty big hit, and it is not just the US alone. Global inflation is on the rise too, with some countries experiencing double digit increases. So, what is causing all this? Is it all because of supply chains, or is there something deeper at play? And how can you fight back against this invisible tax on your daily life? This is Finance and Investment Hub, where we educate you on how to build your personal financial wealth. Inflation is basically the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services increases over time. And no, it is not just a random thing. So when you hear people talk about inflation being at, say, 5%, what that really means is that on average, prices for stuff are 5% higher than last year. So if you spent $100 on groceries last year, this year you might need $105 for the same stuff. But it is not just about prices going up. Inflation is a sign of an economy growing, or sometimes struggling. It is like the economy's heartbeat. It can be too slow, too fast, or just right. Key measurements of inflation. So we all know inflation is everywhere, but how do we actually measure it? Consumer Price Index, CPI. This is the most common way to track inflation. Essentially, it looks at how much the price of a typical basket of goods and services, like food, rent, and gas, changes over time. If those prices go up, so does the CPI Producer Price Index. This one tracks how much producers pay for raw materials and goods before they hit the shelves. If the PPI goes up, that usually means higher costs for consumers down the road. And then there is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. But this one is pretty important too. It measures the prices consumers are actually paying for things, but it is a bit broader than CPI, and it takes into account changes in consumer behavior. Causes of inflation. It is not just one thing that causes those rising prices. Let us break it down. First up, we have demand pull inflation. This happens when demand for goods and services is higher than what the economy can produce. Think about it. When more people want to buy stuff, but there is not enough to go around, prices go up. It is basic supply and demand. Have you ever noticed how prices spikes when people start stocking up on stuff, like right before a holiday or a big storm? That's demand pull inflation in action. There is cost push inflation. This is when the cost of producing goods goes up. Think of higher wages, more expensive raw materials, or disruptions in supply chains. When it costs more to make something, the costs are usually passed on to you, the consumer. Remember the global supply chain issues in 2020? That was a perfect example of cost push inflation. When factories cannot get enough supplies or workers, prices on finished goods climb. Then there is monetary inflation. When the government or central banks print more money, but the amount of goods and services stays the same, the value of money drops. So you end up needing more money to buy the same things. It's like the economy is flooded with cash, but that cash does not go as far. Effects of inflation. Have you ever stopped to think about how inflation impacts different parts of society, like you, businesses, the government, and even the entire economy? Let us examine how inflation hits individuals like you and me. We are the ones at the checkout counter, watching our bills go up. Rising prices mean that what we can buy with our paychecks shrinks, and that is called a loss of purchasing power. Think about it. When prices rise faster than your wages, your paycheck does not go as far. And do not forget about savings. Inflation erodes the value of money, which means your savings might not stretch as far in the future as they would today, unless your investments can keep up. Now let us talk about businesses. They are also feeling the pain. When the cost of raw materials, labor, or transportation goes up, businesses often have to raise their prices to cover those costs. But here is the thing. If prices rise too quickly, it can scare customers away. So businesses have to juggle higher costs with keeping customers happy. If inflation keeps going up, some businesses may struggle to stay afloat, especially smaller ones without the cash reserves to weather a storm. What about the government? Well, inflation is a big challenge for policymakers. When prices rise, the government has to think about how to manage everything from taxes to public spending. It is a balancing act. If they print too much money to stimulate the economy, inflation could get worse. At the same time, the government needs to ensure that inflation does not hurt the economy too much, so they often raise interest rates to control it. And finally, the economy as a whole is really impacted by inflation. On one hand, inflation can signal a growing economy, especially when it is driven by increased demand for goods and services. But on the other hand, too much inflation can lead to economic instability. People stop spending, businesses slow down, and investment drops. How the government can control inflation. What can the government actually do about inflation? How do they control inflation? And can they really make a difference? First up, let's talk about interest rates. One of the most powerful tools the government can use to control inflation is the central bank. The central bank can raise interest rates to cool down inflation. How does that work? Well, when interest rates go up, borrowing money becomes more expensive. When loans and credit cards cost more, people tend to borrow less. That means less spending, less demand for goods and services, and prices start to stabilize. Boo, there is a catch. Higher interest rates can also slow down the economy, so the central bank has to be careful not to raise rates too high or too fast. Another tool is the government spending. When inflation is high, the government can decide to cut back on spending. By reducing government expenditures, like building new projects or expanding programs, they can reduce the amount of money flowing through the economy. This can help lower demand and cool off inflation. Then there is monetary policy, where the government controls the money supply. The central bank can either print more money or reduce the amount of money in circulation. If there is too much money floating around, it can drive prices up. But if there is too little money, that can stifle economic growth. So again, it is all about finding that sweet spot. Finally, there is something called price controls. This is where the government sets limits on how much certain goods and services can cost. It is like putting a cap on the price of things like rent, gas, or food. But while this can help in the short term, price controls can lead to shortages because businesses might not want to sell at lower prices if it cuts into their profits. Therefore, if prices are too low, businesses may just stop supplying the goods. So while price controls can be a quick fix, they are not always the best long-term solution. So to wrap things up, inflation is a natural part of any economy. It is driven by a combination of supply, demand, production costs, and even monetary policies. But what really matters is how it is managed. Too much inflation, it erodes the value of your savings. Too little or negative inflation leads to deflation, and the economy can slow down dramatically.